Welcome to Complex Creatures, exploring spirituality and the common good.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Complex Creatures, a podcast where we explore spirituality and the common good. Today with us is a friend of mine, Professor Jennifer Kraft. She's written a wonderful book called Placemaking in the Arts, Cultivating the Christian Life. Jennifer is a professor of humanities and theology at Point University in West Point, Georgia. She did her PhD at the University of St. Andrews. She's an artist herself, and she's particularly interested not just in what art says about the human story or the human experience, but how art can be a part of making something called place. Now, the word place is a word that we use maybe really so frequently we don't even think about what it means. So we're going to ask her what makes a place as opposed to just a general or maybe just a more basic sense of a space or of a point of geography on a map. We're going to ask about how placemaking and the arts go together and how these things can add to one's experience of life as well as community, how it might enrich and enliven one's spiritual pursuits, and how it might contribute to the common good. So today, I am here, Jared Longbonds. Good to see you again. I'm with my friend Alan. Say hi, Alan.
Hey, great to see you both.
And then Jennifer, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. Good to talk to you both.
We welcome you. How are you doing on this fine November rainy day? Is it rainy where you are?
It is. It's gray and rainy, and yeah, I'm in the office doing some work. I feel productive despite the dreary weather.
Oh, okay. Well, my son, when he woke up today, he was excited about the rain. He looked out the window. He saw the leaves on the lawn, and he said, "Ooh, it's a cozy day."
That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, for him, he gets excited about it, and he calls it a cozy day because for him, he gets bunker down in our den, and I think he thinks that we're going to watch a movie later because that's how he's thinking. It's a boat.
My 4-year-old was distraught that he couldn't get out and do construction in the yards this morning because it was raining. So we're in a construction phase in the life of the 4-year-old. So.
Absolutely. Well, Jennifer, you're an artist, you're a professor, and you've written a lovely book called Placemaking in the Arts. I thought, let's just kick it off, and let me ask you the question. When you talk about that word placemaking, can you first help us understand what you mean by a concept of place? That just seems like a word we use all the time, but do we really think about what it means? What do you mean by place?
Yeah, so people often differentiate between the terms place and space. So like people who are doing scholarly work in that area, sometimes we talk about space as sort of this abstract, universal, nothing, think of outer space, for example, but space is sort of general. Whereas place is particular, places, includes our embodied practice. It is the result of these engagements that we have with one another. Wallace Stegner, the author, has a really beautiful quote that I always love to describe place. He says, places, something to the effect of places don't become places until people have lived in it and died in it and known it for more than one generation over a long period of time. It becomes a place by slow accrual, like a coral reef. And I just love that image, that place is something that is made over time through these sort of ongoing engagements with it. And so it becomes a part of our identity versus this kind of abstract notion of space more generally.
Yeah, I like to think of space as, it's a geographical place or location that layering onto that is memory, story, culture, experience. And over time, I think of it as kind of this almost as there's a thick existential experience of it. Then after a while, at least that's how I conceive of it. Do you have a favorite place? Do you have a place that is absolutely evocative to you? It just draws you into something deeper that you can think of?
I love a lot of places. The first thing that comes to my mind is I lived in the UK for a long time, and that's where I started thinking about place and placemaking. And so the longleaf pine forest of of Southwest Georgia really sort of formed my imagination, and that was a place that I really longed for. My husband and I both longed for. He's a forester, so the longleaf pine forest is important to both of us, and so yeah, I feel like that place is significant for me. And then all of course the places of my lives, my church and my home and these sort of places that form my everyday experience.
What about you, Alan? Where's a place for you?
I love the fact that the first place that came to her mind is someplace that doesn't have anything to do with man-madeness. The whole time she was talking about place, I'm thinking about the Bajas. And she comes up with um, nature. So a place that's important to me is probably my mother's house. Because we spend so many holidays there, and there's so many family memories.
Yeah. I think of, there's a place in Decatur, Illinois, where I'm from, and it's a conservation district that my great uncle helped start. It's called Rock Springs. And there's part of it that is a pine forest. Jen, your husband, I think, would totally geek out because the pine forest itself was planted as a Christmas tree farm generations ago. And the person who ran that farm got ill and could not take the trees and harvest them. So they've grown up so tall that now it's created this forest where the trees are just straight in a line, and it creates this interesting space to be in, right? But I have spent all the years of my life going out there and doing things in that pine forest, right? So Halloween walks and the fairy tale walks that they put on as a kid. I have had family members get married there. I did my best friend's wedding there. I mean, I've taken dates there. Don't tell my wife, because I also took her there. And it's something more. And anyway, so that's just our little autobiographical stuff.
Yeah,
It's about.
that's fascinating though. This distinction between like nature as natural versus man-made, because in many ways, I mean, so your pine forest is man-made. But even the longleaf pine forests of South Georgia are molded through fire. So one of the ways that they kind of become what they are is through fire, and prescribed fire is something that people do there to help manage the forest, and that's something that's been done for thousands of years, right? So indigenous people, you know, prescribed fire as well. So it would happen naturally as well as through like intervention of humans. So nature, this idea of sort of nature as separate from the places that we make in culture, I think is they're a lot closer than we imagine, right? Like there's never this sort of pure wilderness of nature that's apart from our making of it.
Yeah, that was the area of my research. So like the idea of nature and culture being two separate spheres, it's hard to talk about when we ourselves are natural beings, right? And so you're exactly right. They're not very far away. But let's get to the arts, because one of the things that we're here to talk about is how we can also make place, or be people who utilize the arts in making places. And I know that you do engage the non-human world of creation. You do engage public spaces. You do engage our homes. So talk about, just out loud, and wax with us a bit about how art can be a part of placemaking.
Yeah. So maybe first I'll say a little bit about placemaking, what we mean by placemaking. So I mean, placemaking for me is really just about like orienting your world, right? Um, it speaks to like all the ways that we identify with and physically interact with the places around us, and that's physical, right? So how we arrange furniture in our homes or something, but it's also symbolical, and so we can talk about placemaking in a variety of different spaces of our lives and places of our lives. So, the way that we make pedestrian friendly streets could count as placemaking, but also the liturgy in a church, how we go about doing that and embodying those practices, I think is a form of placemaking, right? That helps connect us with one another, with God, and is, empowering us for mission in the world. So placemaking, I think has this really, how I use the term is really broad, just this kind of orientation of our world. And I think the arts are a really powerful way of of going about placemaking. So in all of those sites that I just mentioned, in public space, in our homes, in our churches, um, we engage with the world in visual ways. I mean, we engage with all of our senses, but I think, how we hang art on the walls and how we make places beautiful, um, how we make them conducive to our comfort and our, inside our imagination. All of those things are really important for the ways that we're connecting with a site, but also with one another within that place. And so I think the arts are this really particular and kind of paradigmatic way that we go about placemaking in the world.
So I think about the philosopher Albert Borgman. Talked a lot about, and he was at Missoula, Montana, and he talked a lot about focal realities. And like if you go into any space, there's usually something that focuses your attention. In a church, it may be an altar. In a home, I think homes traditionally might have a piano or a fireplace, but oftentimes over the shift in culture, the way we've designed our homes, maybe the focal reality of a room is a television at this point in time. But the way we set up rooms and establish them is a way of making space. It's not just all utilitarian. I mean, like it can change the quality of a room. You can almost have a completely different experience walking into a room that's been designed by two separate people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because to orient around a TV, all your furniture is pointed at that thing. You're not pointed at one another, right? So conversation it's not as conducive for conversation and connection. Um, so yeah, I mean the ways, just our arrangements of things um, and even the colors that we use, right? So there's all of this like psychological study of colors, right? Of like how is it that if you paint a room red, how is that going to make your emotional experience different than if you paint a room blue, right? And so all of that visual experience, I think, is contributing to the way that we experience a place and the way that we experience one another within a place.
So and I think in homes, probably for a typical American family, um, would you suggest that art is mostly there to be sort of just just a piece of decoration?
I think art can be decoration, and it is an important form of decoration. But it's not only that, even in our home. So when I think about the role of art in my home, I choose things because they embody memories for me, right? So they may be photographs, but they also may be pieces of art that I've bought on trips or that are from artists that I know and I'm friends with. And so when I see that image, it incites a memory for me, right? So that becomes a form of kind of self-reflection um, and self-identity over time, right? That I kind of connect my story. Um, I enjoy putting artworks that are maybe a little bit of a challenge for me, and so artworks that I enjoy looking at, but that maybe are something that causes me to ask questions or um, ask me, make me reflect on like what does this mean for who I am or who I want to be. So I think the art in our home can do a lot more than just decorate.
Well, I think that's true. I was just thinking that most of us probably think about it in terms of decoration. So this leads me to a few things to say and then ask. First one is that I can hear some of the things that you said in your TED talk that you gave. For those of you who haven't been able to do much looking yet, I want you after this to go to Jennifer Kraft and search TEDx. She does a nice TED talk. She talks about how her and her husband have purchased art for their home and how it recalls memory of the artist and maybe moments in the past, which I think is quite lovely, and I commend it to you all. But I did want to ask you about how um, sometimes art seems to be making a social point. Sometimes art might be prophetic, or it might be a criticism. And I was just wondering about the role of that in making a place. So I think if we're right now we're talking about a home, uh, and I would suggest that probably 99% of people, they probably want something that's endearing or comforting or welcoming in a home. Now, there might be somebody who wants to make another sort of statement. Uh, what do you think about how art can be utilized that is in the more critical, socially oriented milieu and maybe the prophetic? How can that help with making place? And
Yeah.
let me give you a quick story real quick. We did an art show here at the church, and it was all about human trafficking. That was the theme of the art show, and a lot of kids at the SCAD school next to Savannah College of Art and Design put in pieces, and there was this one of a child who was in a prisoner jumpsuit, and I. We had the hardest time knowing what to do with it after the art show because the pieces were purchased. And that one hung up in my associate minister's office for years because it was meaningful. The piece was meaningful, but none of us really wanted to hang it in our home, right? And so, but there is a place for it. So anyway, I just wanted you to talk with me about what your thoughts are reacting to that.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say that context matters, right? So you're right. Our homes are something that are personal, they are comfortable, they are spaces of hospitality and welcome, hopefully. And so yeah, you're probably not going to put something super offensive or just really, really hard, like, in your hanging in your bedroom or like over your fireplace or something. You could, but yeah, you're right that most people are not. Um, so yeah, context matters. I mean, in the church is a really interesting place to think about that because I mean, there are some things I would say like definitely should not be hung in a church, right?
Sure.
Uh, because of what type of space it's meant to be, because it's supposed to invite worship and community, and so there may be things that are appropriate or inappropriate for that space. But I do think that the challenge of the artist, right? So artists do often challenge and disrupt our ways of seeing, and so the church is a fascinating place to think about, like what are the lines that we might kind of draw there. And I think that will be dependent upon the community that's there, right? Like, does the community have a language for the arts? Do they sort of understand the story and the purpose of the arts? And so I would say, like, your congregation is pretty art knowledgeable for the most part, from what I experienced. And so, maybe pushing them a little bit more through the arts is something that could be really valuable. But a congregation that like nobody's really interested in the arts, sort of like the like really rural, small congregations that I grew up attending in my childhood, would not really know how to engage with art like that. So I think that the place for particularly like social criticism and challenging art, I mean, museum spaces are a really significant space for this because you elect to go, right? Like you're choosing to go to there. And you're choosing to go to church, but it's a little bit different like way of engagement, right? And so I think the museum space can be a point of challenge. And then I think public space, and again, there are some contextual challenges there, where are you putting it and what exactly is it of? Um, but I think art does have this profound power to challenge our imaginations and to maybe ask us to see differently. And that, I think, especially in the world today where we're sort of asking ourselves questions about what does it mean to belong somewhere? What does it mean like in a post-pandemic context of like when we're thinking about what does it mean to form community after this like long time of being apart and then sort of feeling like strangers once we got back together and all of the social unrest that came about, during that time. How are we sort of renegotiating our places and our communities together? And I think art can be a really significant way of asking us to expand our imaginations in that regard. Yeah.
So in your book, you talk about, I mean, we are embodied creatures. And I mean, I think it's not just certain strands of spirituality that want to separate our spirits from our bodies. I think that's kind of in a lot of places in the Western world, where we kind of think about the thinking life or the interior life, and then there's the external life. And whether we consciously or unconsciously think about it like that, we swim in those waters at times. So art, you talk about it as a way of reminding us and calling us to our senses, calling us to our bodies, calling us to our. Is there a better way you can put that for us? It's calling us to our lived experience as it really is as a bodily creature in the world.
Yeah, I think it calls attention. I've talked about like our embeddedness in the world, right? Art can kind of speak to that. But art is also, I mean, it gives us transcendent experience at the same time, right? Like it takes us away to another world. Or, I mean, icons are a prime example of this as a particular type of art. But I think that lots of art, secular art, can also be this sort of spiritual transcendent experience. And again, I think that speaks to the necessary connection between the spiritual and the physical, that they're not these two, we don't live in a dualistic world, as much as some folks might ask us to think about it that way. But we are connected. And so the embeddedness that we experience can also be a form of transcendent experience. So those aren't mutually exclusive. And I think art handles that in a really interesting way, that it can simultaneously be physical and engage us in the physical while also inducing the spiritual, extra material experience.
Well, that's fascinating. That's a fascinating experience to have, and I think I've had one. I wanted to ask both of you, Alan and Jennifer, have you had an experience with art that almost gave you a transcendent, maybe call it mystical, or just general spiritual experience? Have you had an experience like that you could even describe for us? Either one of you, both of you.
I'll let Jennifer talk first.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to think of particular things that I've seen. I mean, I think certainly architecture has produced that experience a lot. So when I lived in Scotland and have traveled Europe, the sort of great cathedrals there are this transcendent experience that's embedded within the physical space, right? The place is attempting to give you that transcendent experience. So I think that's one like sort of more obvious example. I mean, I think my husband and I took a trip to Belgium one time, and we spent all of our time in pubs and churches. Like that was just our because I was the goal who wants to have Belgian beer and look at a bunch of art. And one of the things that we did was to take a pilgrimage to see the Ghent altarpiece, and that was a really transcendent experience for me. I think because that piece holds so much like art historically, right? That holds so much meaning art historically. But I think just like the traveling to get there and being in the space and understanding its history, and also seeing just the sort of beautiful painting of that image, was a way to kind of connect to the physical pilgrimage that we made, but then also the experience through the artwork itself.
That's interesting because you're talking about the travel in place-based terminology, because you talk about it with pilgrimage, which, if we don't think about it in place-based terminology, or at least with the content that we've ascribed to place-basedness, it's just touring. You're just going from point A to point B to see something. But for you, there all that thickness of experience went with you, the whole thing. And so each step of your journey was in anticipation of something transformative, possibly.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the journey was a part of that, and it was very intentional, right? So we weren't just gonna go in and glance at it for a minute, and I mean, you can't take pictures in there, but post to Instagram and say we'd been there. But it was an intentional experience to I think too, like, to see the artwork in person, because I think seeing artwork in person is really significant. It's a wholly different experience being in a place with something than like seeing a photograph of it. but also it like to connect over time. And I think images like that and cathedrals, like I mentioned, throughout Europe, and they're places that people have visited for sometimes thousands of years, right? And so the experience of the journey to be in that place and to walk the same ways, to touch the pillars of a place, um, to even like um, I was at the Sistine Chapel a couple years ago, and you can see pictures of it and all this, but like I really wanted to think about like all of my sense how all my senses were working in there, right? So the smell of, I mean, there are lots of people, so there's that smell, but like the smell of the fresco, the smell of the plaster that has been there, the sound of people's whispers, echoing off of that. And um so that, and knowing that people have made that journey, and that, have sat there and reflected on, um, the person of Christ, right? So, or, whatever aspect that is they're looking at, that they have engaged in this kind of spiritual experience. And so my engagement in that spiritual experience there is a form of connection, not only to God, but also to those other people and those pilgrims that have come before me.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. Alan, did you have one you wanted to share?
So my relationship with art is significantly lower brow, and I would say that the art that's been most meaningful to me has always been storytelling based. And I know that a lot of highbrow art has deep stories to tell in all the ways that we've been describing in this discussion. Um, but I'm a comic book guy, and that's where my heart lives. And the artist whose work has probably given me the most um, transcendent experience is probably a guy named Alex Toth. Alex Toth was the guy who did the majority of his best work in the 60s and 70s. And what's really amazing about Alex's work is his ability to communicate really, really complicated ideas with incredibly simple shapes. So more so than probably any of the other comic book artists out there that I could point you towards. Um, he is able to derive meaning from, what is essentially just a couple of uh, of of shapes on a page that we read as something other than those simple shapes. And a lot of comic book artists get very noodly and they do all kinds of crazy hatching and things. That was never anything that Toth got into. And I would say that this ability to just communicate with incredibly simple visual language is something that is always deeply inspiring to me.
Wow.
And as far as like going somewhere to see his work, um, he's a famous enough guy in sort of the inner circle of comic book artists that a lot of times they'll have galleries of his work at different conventions or frankly even museums around say New York. And I have seen some of his work in person, and it's always amazing, but not nearly as well preserved as some of the higher brow arts out there. So as a result of that, the majority of my experience has been seeing it in the form that it's designed for, which is reproduction in books.
Well, very, very interesting. Like the simple to the and being invited in by something very simple, what appears to be simple, revealing the complexities and depth. Wow, that's interesting. Jen, I was interested in thinking about church spaces because you mentioned cathedrals, you mentioned our church, and I was thinking about how art in a religious posture has done a lot of different things over the years and has looked a lot of different ways. Um, what is your sense about maybe art that is more abstract versus more art that is more meant to educate or have a direct message? First of all, I know that people with artistic sensibilities probably make their own decisions on what they consider to be art, good art, bad art, and all so on and so forth. It seems like a lot of art that is maybe more religious in tone, at least in a modern milieu, it seems like a lot of it is pretty sermonic. It seems like it has a pretty clear message. And I think a lot of churches might lean into that for maybe adorning their hallways or their Sunday school rooms or something like that. What is your sense of that kind of art and placemaking and its benefit or not?
Yeah, all the churches that I have been a part of have preferred, images of Jesus and Jesus with children and the sort of like traditional like images from the Bible. We're
He's got sheep and there's lighthouses and things, you know?
yeah, so there's sort of that like, uh, what we might call like Christian kitsch. movement.
Yeah.
Um,
Think so.
And I think there is a place for that, and a lot of people really identify with that and find comfort in that art. Very often it's not perceived as like particularly high art or good art. A lot of the time, I guess it depends on what it is. But yeah, I mean, I think there is certainly a role for art to illustrate the biblical story, to teach us something about the Bible. And there's certainly a role for that in church. But I would very often encourage congregations to just sort of expand their vision of what that really means. So, like the images that I'm thinking of are pretty often like really kind of sentimental images, right? They're sweet, they're nice, they're, you know, Jesus like patting little, blonde haired kids on the head and giving them blessings. And so, there are lots of Bible stories that are maybe not so sentimental and sweet that could be an interesting way to illustrate the Bible in the context of church. Um, but yeah, I think that abstract art, while it's very often not used in church or not shown in church, can be a really profound space of spiritual engagement. I mean, a lot of the like modern abstract artists were interested in doing spiritual work. Artists like Rothko and Kandinsky and others had a very spiritual way of thinking about their art. And like for instance, Rothko, like when you go to a museum, very often his installations or shows are sort of oriented almost like a sacred space, like a worship space. Um, I think that the question in churches is people don't really know what to do with it. They don't have a language for engaging with it. Um, and so they're just kind of confused. And I have found that because I've done, art shows in churches before where we've had visiting works, and some of them were really kind of easy to engage with, and some of them were more difficult and abstract. But when they were explained to the congregation, or at least like the congregation was kind of given a language for engaging with them, they liked it a lot more, and they were actually more attuned to kind of sitting with it and thinking about it more. So I think in some sense, like in a church context, um, a little bit of education and like artistic education is required for being able to engage with things like that because a lot of times people don't have the language or the story for what to do with it.
I was at St. John's College up in Minnesota. There's a writer's workshop that I was a part of one summer, and so you do the writer's workshop stuff, and in the morning you go pray with the monks because there's their monastery that's attached to the university. And I should have probably looked this up, but I didn't know we'd go here, or I'd go here. But the church itself that is built by a famous architect who I believe was German. He was an atheist, but he wanted to build this church. It's an incredible design. I think it's brutalist, which I don't like brutalist architecture. The stained glass windows are abstract colors. And the building itself is mostly interesting in terms of an architectural feat, in that the balance of the building has to do with how this bell tower comes out of the building and through the ground and then up outside with the bells exposed. But after we had a prayer session with these monks, one of them giving us a bit of a tour, talked about how the space itself, and mind you, by the way, this was just after Vatican II when it was designed, so there was like an attempt to be open to architects who, into a world that wasn't precisely Catholic or Christian, and so that's the reason why this engagement happened. But he talked about the history behind the person who designed it, and then he said to me, it's interesting, if you sit here in prayer long enough, you will see students cut through the sanctuary to go from one class to another, and they just go about their business talking. They don't stop. They don't look around. They certainly don't pray. And then the monk goes, "This place does not demand your prayers." And he goes, "I'm not sure why. I'd like for you to think about it and you tell me why." He goes, "But there are places where I am that demand your prayers." And I've thought about that a lot. I'm not sure I have a strong definition for what should demand your prayer or why, but it's sort of anecdotally been true for me that there are spaces and there are adornments and there are structures that seem to cause me to stop and elevate my mind or think in different ways. And there are others that kind of just lead me through in a utilitarian sense. I don't know.
Uh, that that is really fascinating. I just sort of think of like the difference between worshiping in like a Gothic cathedral versus a warehouse or something like that. These sort of modern worship spaces, and yeah, I mean they ask something different of you. So when I walk into a Gothic cathedral, you sort of notice that people become more silent, right? They sort of hush themselves and quiet themselves, and because the space demands it, right? Um, and yeah, I think there is something to that. I do think that I often teach Simone Weil's article on, it's called The Right Use of School Studies. And she talks about attention and prayer in that essay, and how when we give our attention to something, it becomes a practice for the attention giving that we give in prayer. And she gives the example of when we give attention to like our geometry, that is a significant form of attention giving, because in the act of giving attention at all, then we are practicing this kind of prayerful attitude. And I think that there is something to art, whether it's abstract or explicitly spiritual or whatever, but that's asking for our attention, right? Like the art is, it's asking us to look at it, to be with it for a while. And I think one of the problems is that the contemporary world that we live in is not very good at giving attention, right? I mean, there's like all sorts of research that shows like people can't pay attention to, reading something for more than 3 minutes without getting distracted or something. We sort of measure our attention in like TikTok videos or something. And so I think that art can be this form of practice for us of attention giving. And for me, I think in the church, that could be a really powerful way to understand the role of art, is that it's not so much about like teaching the Bible story or illustrating something or decorating the space, but that at least in some contexts, it could be a way to train us in the act of giving our attention to something that is beautiful or challenging or whatever it is. And that is a really countercultural practice for living in the world today. And that trains us to give our attention to other human beings and to the great world that we live in, and ultimately to God in prayer.
This is hitting right on the topic of what we're here to talk about. So spirituality and how that plays out in ways beyond just ourselves. But before I even ask any more about that, giving attention, I wanted to ask you specifically about a practice that you revealed in your TED Talk that you and your husband are doing in your own home, where you're trying to fill it with art that from people. Okay, if I get this right, it's either art that you purchase from local artists or it's artists that you've known. It's not high production art, right, or reproduced art. Right? You're looking for originals for your home. Is that?
Yeah, so we decided a while back that we wanted to, not have art that we like bought from Target or Hobby Lobby or somewhere like that. But there was original art in some way. And we have a lot of prints, right? So like signed original prints, because those are cheaper than, um, you know, giant oil paintings or something. Um, but yeah, the idea of having original art in our home has been really important for us. And the reason for that, um, is, I mean, the things that I already mentioned of connecting to a person, right? So sometimes it's an artist that I know, and very often, like when I walk by a favorite, there's an encaustic painting that I have from a good friend of mine, whose husband is a theologian, and I think about them and their family almost every time I walk by, and very often will like say a short prayer for them. And so that artwork is enjoyable for me to look at, and for other people to look at, but it also becomes this like prayerful practice of, thinking about people within my community. So I think about art in my home, for a lot of those reasons. I also, we have used like icons and other sort of like religious art in our home to kind of create more of a space of spiritual reflection. Very often we'll try to put icons at doorways or entrance points, just to sort of think about how we're like going out into the world or coming back into our home as a spiritual practice. Um, and then I think there is something too just about like our home economy, right? So um, I read a lot of Wendell Berry. He's very influential in my thinking about place and community. And he likes to think about this wider understanding of our home economics, and the economics of a place. And so I think about my practice of buying art, original art too, as maybe being a little bit countercultural in my engagement with the economy, that I'm not buying something that is made cheaply and made ultimately to be thrown away, but I'm supporting someone who is doing hard creative work that very often they feel called to by God. Um, or, in some sort of general sense of that, they feel compelled to do that creative work, and that is good creative work. And so my directing my money towards them versus something that's mass produced, in a factory in China somewhere, is a way of creating a more responsible home economics as well.
So art can call you to pay attention, which is radically countercultural, as you said, uh, deeply spiritual, and that it can transcend you from your present moment to something deeper, more profound, and then also draw you right back into your present. It can call your attention to your friends, to your loved ones, to your memories. It's spurned you on to prayer. It also calls your attention to maybe even how you spend your money, but in particular ways, even to think about the work that goes into making the work. I mean, Alan and I talk because Alan, he teaches digital communication, and he does a lot of digital communication. And right now, he dabbles with AI stuff wherever it's going to serve. I mean, I think that's what people do right now. Is we all a little afraid, or a lot afraid, of where all this is going to go. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So we try to figure stuff out, right? And right now anybody can go on AI software and create art and images, right? We don't even need artists anymore.
Yes, yeah.
Hate to be sarcastic, and I just see how you both respond, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you say something about that, Alan, and then I'll.
Yeah, sure. I have a handful of thoughts about a handful of different things that have been said, so I'll try to
Well,
spit it,
chime
pump
in,
in,
buddy.
and see what goes on here. Okay, I'll talk AI, and then I'll back up in the conversation just a smidgen. So I don't think that AI is capable of making anything that I would call art. I think that what AI does is, uh, I think that what AI does is, um, lowest common denominator combinations of other artwork. And AI doesn't do a good job of thinking through composition for communication in any sort of significant way. It doesn't do a good job of consistency between images, which is a big deal for someone like me who's worried about the storytelling of multiple images being set back to back. Um, and so really all it's going to be able to do is generate, very, very simple things. In fact, whenever I've tried to get AI to do multiple subjects at the same time, it can't do that. It can only do a subject. And I really think that there's a lot of snake oil in the whole AI art thing. I think that it's a lot of hooey, and
No soul.
what it really reminds me of
Yeah.
are freshman artists that I work with who are really, really good at rendering but don't know anything about art.
Yes.
Um,
To date, all it really does is do a good job of or copying from Lars, right?
right.
Okay, right. And I say
Yeah. Okay, so then the thing that I wanted to back up in the conversation and say, and I hope this doesn't derail us, because I have a tendency to start thinking about stuff that's being said, and then I'll say something that's loosely on topic, and then I feel like I derail conversations, which was part of the reason I was keeping my mouth shut, but I'm going to go ahead and say it right now, is I think that the church in mass is art illiterate by design. I think that I have this theory that during the Reformation, uh, and I'm talking, hundreds of years ago, I think that during the Reformation, we got trained to think about art, the kind of art that we're talking about today, as stuff for the elites and stuff that is reproducible as being for people. And I think that there's a snobbery against real art, stuff that's one-off, stuff that is designed to challenge the way that we think, as opposed to be on the nose. I think that there is a problem in us experiencing that in the church, because we've been trained to think by way of whatever sort of cultural undertone we've developed in the church, to not pay attention to it. That it's something that we should be. It's something that's going to get us off the target vision we're supposed to be having as Christians. Anyway, there you go. Those are my thoughts.
Well, I'm not sure I'm versed enough in the history of art to know about how to assess your theory. I do believe we've gone through periods of anti-intellectualization, but Dr. Kraft, Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on what Alan said? Does that track with what your thoughts would be on that?
I think the Reformation, it took art out of the worship space. A lot of the reformers thought that art was distracting, um, you know, from the purpose of worship, right? So Calvin didn't want art in the worship space. Luther was okay with it sometimes, and then you had others like Zwingli that thought like all art was terrible. So so there were lots of even like Reformation attitudes towards the arts, but I think the legacy of that is that the Protestant imagination developed around this sort of like emptiness of the worship space. Like it's not filled with a lot of visual stimulation. And that is an aesthetic, right? So I think it is important not to say that like that's wholly negative. There is a space for that. But when we say that art is, ultimately an evil or, distracting, I think is problematic. But then I think that then is paired, yeah, that then is paired with this sort of like Enlightenment sensibilities of art as being for contemplation. And then this like very solid separation between high art and low art, and, art for museum spaces versus not art in life. And so we sort of took art out of everyday life in the Enlightenment and beyond. And I think to me, that hits on the real problem of the fact that now we think like, if I want to look at art, I'm going to go to a museum and look at art. But in fact, like art should live around us, right? And that's my point about saying that we should have art in our home, but in our churches and in our public spaces, that art is what Nicholas Wolterstorff calls an object and an instrument of action. And that art can actually be a really important form of responsible practice and placemaking for the common good, right? That in all these places of our lives, it forms a visual language. It can form a visual language if we allow it to. But that is going to require some sort of intentionality with the way that we think about art in our spaces, because up until this point, we've not seen that to be the case, I think.
Wow, interesting. I didn't think we were going to go to the Reformation at all. So thank you, Alan.
Sorry.
No. When I think about the Reformation and trying to tie things that we've said before, we mentioned that Jennifer, you went to the University of St. Andrews for your doctorate, so you were over there in the UK. My mentor in college did his doctoral work in Scotland, and so his children were born there, and several, many formative years of their life they lived there, and they would go on these tours around St. Andrews and other places where the Scottish Reformation was taking place, and they would go to these. They would look at churches that had been torn down because they had all these beautiful adornments and things, and they would hear the language of the reformers talking about speaking against the excesses of the church or the abuses of the church. And my mentor, my old professor's son, who was, I don't know, he was probably 8, 9, 10 years old at the time, he's listening to all of it and watching all of it, and he said to his parents, "Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys?" And it's out of the mouths of babes, like he's hearing the injustices being challenged as a good thing, but he's seeing the tearing down of art, and the beautiful is also a bad thing. And so like that really made him question. And I've often thought how easy it is for us to just go flip flop, either or, pendulum swing.
Yeah, when any extreme is going to be problematic, right? I mean, we see that in Reformation struggles, we see that in modern politics, we see that all over the place. And yeah, I mean, I think the answer to this question is, they're both sides are both good and bad.
Yeah. I love what you said earlier, and I can't draw our attention to the fact that you say art calls us to attention, and how subversive that is, and is obviously how spiritual that can be. I want to talk about, for brief moments, some of the work that you do. So everybody, like I said, Jen does art, but she's a professor doing humanities, art, theology, all that stuff, how it all works together. But she's got I believe you have a grant, correct? A sabbatical grant? Is it a sabbatical?
Yeah. I'm done with the sabbatical grant, and then I'm on the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship does teacher scholar grant. So I'm like right now.
Let's talk about that teacher scholar grant, because sometimes we like to talk about how our spiritual tools and things can also help us to all be better and maybe elevate the commons. And so we had Dr. Kraft as a scholar in residence at our church here at Peachtree Christian, where she did art and education and then did an art installation. But she has something special going on right now, or she's working on right now. And I'd love for you to share it with everybody.
Yeah. So right now I'm working on a book on place displacement and the Christian imagination. And that book, I'm thinking about, I'm really sort of extending my work on placemaking, but thinking about some of the tensions that are inherent in the ways that we go about engaging with places and seeing places, and the ways that very often our what I say, our sense of place is tied up and entangled with our sins of place, with the ways that we have displaced various communities historically and in the present day. And so
you go up to indigenous people.
Yeah, so every chapter is a Christian doctrine put into conversation with scripture and some issue of place and displacement. So I talk about indigenous displacement in the section on the doctrine of creation, and this idea of nothingness that we attribute to the land. And so to kind of go back to that question of nature, culture, how humans are engaging with their places. My Christology chapter is engaging with immigration debate. My church chapter is looking at sort of like urban development, gentrification, sort of issues. So every chapter is looking at some issue of place and displacement. My chapter on the church that I'm writing for this grant is really looking at the role of the church as confessing our sins of place and understanding their relationship to places and confessing those in a way that is moving us towards redemption, right? Towards more of a reconciling practice. And so I'm looking at the role of confessional prayer. So if you're part of a church that engages the kind of traditional liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer, then you say a confessional prayer every week, right? So we confess the things that we have done and the things that we have left undone, or in different language, we confess sins that are known and unknown. So I'm interested in this question of what does it mean to confess of sins unknown, particularly as it relates to our play, right? So like, how is it that even in our best attempts, sometimes, like in the case of gentrification, we're, very often like rich white people are going into a place and trying to make a neighborhood there and pursue economic development. But that displaces existing communities that have been there for very often for decades. And so how do those kind of two things work in tension with one another? And how is the church very often a major part of these relationships and tendencies within a place? The grant, so I'm doing that writing, but then over the course of Lent, in the spring, we'll be doing a workshop on confessional prayer where our church is engaging together and thinking about our historical relationship to our city and to our place, but also the ongoing ways that perhaps we as Christians have these more problematic engagements to our natural environment, to thinking about like race relations, or so these kind of points at which like there are those tensions inherent in the way that the church is engaging in even local mission. So where they'll be writing confessional prayers and engaging in confessional prayer throughout that time, and then those will end in a collaborative art project that the church is doing together, which will be sort of mapping our place and piecing together this language of place and displacement, and thinking about how is it that perhaps the church may need to be in a mode of confession as it relates to our placemaking practices, but also how can we imagine our future in more redemptive and reconciling ways than what it has been. And so we're sort of using the creative practice to think about that, and that will result in a piece of artwork that will be public facing because our church sits on a major public walking trail in our city. And so so it will be for our congregation a form of self-reflection and spirituality through the creative practice, but also sit as a form of communication to our community to say, this is how we're sort of thinking about our mission as placemakers in the city, in the neighborhood, in the natural world that we find ourselves in a way that that laments what needs to be lamented and remembers what needs to be remembered, and envisions a future together that is more reflective of the kingdom of God.
Wow. That crosses all the things that I'm interested in a podcast like this. Wonderful work. Good job. Hey, do you have like 3 or 4 book recommendations or documentary recommendations on these concepts or ideas or adjacent ideas that you give the audience? We've already plugged your book and we'll continue to do so, but anything else that you recommend?
So art, placemaking, anything?
Anything, just, whatever you're interested in. You tell us, help us fill up our book lists longer. And it's
Yes. Okay. Let's see. I've been reading a lot of Willie James Jennings for my work. So his book, Christian Imagination, is I'm always going to recommend. And I wish his new book would come out. He's, they're writing this new book, on doctrine of creation and land, and so I'm super excited for that to come out. And I wish it would. If I can tell Jennings, to push that through. So that book, and then I mentioned Nicholas Wolterstorff's Art in Action. That is an old book. It was published in 1980, but it was the first book that I read in theology and the arts that, like, during my junior year of college, that really influenced the way that I think about art in everyday life, and art as a responsibility for Christians to engage in our places, and just the responsibility of creative making generally. So it's an oldie but a goodie if nobody has read it. I just contributed to a new book that's coming out in the next year on the Holy Spirit and art. So I'll plug that book. So it's on pneumatology in the arts, and it's an edited volume, but every chapter looks at some name for the Holy Spirit, some way of naming the Holy Spirit, and an art form in conversation with one another. So I'm attempting to do constructive Christian doctrine there and understanding the Holy Spirit and the arts.
So what's the name of it?
It's called Pneumatology, Naming the Spirit, Pneumatology in the Arts, I think. So it will come out with IVP in 2025.
Oh, great.
So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, now I want you to stick around after we sign off here, okay? I got a couple of things to share with you. But, friends, you need to go check out Jennifer Craft's TEDx talk. She has a website, and that is www.what?
JenniferACraft.com.
There you go. You can see more there. You can also take a look at the books that we mentioned earlier, and learn more about placemaking, the arts, and maybe ways that I think if we asked her more, she'd probably encourage you all to take up maybe doing a little bit of art yourself, even if you're not a self-described artist.
We're all creative makers of our places.
That's exactly right. All right, my friends, peace be with you, and we'll see you next time. God bless.